Our next presentation in the education track, by the way, my name's Steve Morris, for those of you I don't know. I run the Assets, thank you, hello. I run the Asset Schools business for Mainstream, which is all of our training courses. We've got 23 training courses and we're sponsoring this room. And in fact, Rafe Britton is not only our master trainer of our lubrication curriculum, but he's also the author of it, and a very well-known lubrication guy. We were talking last night about how niche lubrication can get, and I'll let you tell some of those hysterical stories you were telling me. His business is Lubrication Expert, and that's also his website where you can get a treasure trove of information. Rafe's going to be talking to us about 5 fast fixes, easy lubrication wins, and he really is one of the world's gurus on all things lubrication, so listen up, take notes. After he's presented, would you please evaluate him on the app? We'd really appreciate that. We'll give him back the feedback, unless you say he's horrible, in which case we'll lie and tell him we thought he was great. But it would be good to know so we don't invite him back. So please do evaluate, and you can get there by going to find his name, clicking on his session, and just scoring what you thought of him. And then he'll be at the next break, which is the coffee break, at the Deloitte Speakers Corner to field any questions. If he's not there, you'll find him at the Asset Schools booth talking to people about lubrication. I think that's all, folks, other than to promote one last time the survey just outside the room. Anyone here not done the survey? Show of hands. Anyone not done the survey? Trip to the UK and a trip to Melbourne are the prizes, lucky draw prizes, if you do the survey. It's 5 minutes. I reckon it's worth it. And you might get some merch. Anyway, over to you, Rafe. Thank you.
Steve. Thanks, Steve. Wow, so not much writing on this presentation, huh? Might not be invited back, geez. Now, let's get a few things out of the way just to begin with. So first of all, I am aware that Lubrication Expert is the most arrogant sounding business name of all time, right? Self-styled, right? It's one of those fake it till you make it type deals. The reality is when I went out on my own as an independent consultant 4 years ago, you need a website, right? And all the good names are taken at this point. As it turns out, just like there's a .com and there's a .com.au, .expert is actually a domain. And lubrication.expert was available, and it cost me all of $8 to buy. So hence the business name. So today, we're going to be talking through nothing like many of the other presentations, which are all focused on AI and sort of bleeding edge type stuff. We're going to get down into the weeds, and this is frankly a very kind of prosaic discussion, right? There's nothing extremely technical about it. It's not as future forward or as fancy. But frankly, I think in some ways it's more valuable because my experience of lubrication is that at most sites I go to, it is grim. I don't know what the state is at your various sites. If you've come through Lube School 1, no doubt you've made improvements at your own site, and yours is perfect, right? On the other hand, I've been to places which are pretty awful. Just a little anecdote before we get started. The business is starting to grow a little bit, and I need some help on occasion. And I happen to have a mate who I've known since kindergarten who has the fortune or misfortune. His dad kind of passed away relatively early and left him a lot of money. So he's been retired for the last 18 years. He's my age. Right? Now his kids have started to go to school and he's kind of got nothing to do with his day, and he said, I've got nothing to do, what do you think? I said, why don't you tag along with me to a couple of site visits and things like that? He said, Rafe, I don't know if your job is highly technical. I don't think I could contribute anything. I said, you don't understand. 10 to 15% of my job is highly technical. I work with additive companies, we're looking at new oil formulations, we're developing new additive technologies to replace the current chemistries. All of that stuff is highly technical. To be honest, though, 90% of my job is turning up at sites and treating them like I treat my 7-year-old, telling them to clean up their own room, right? You go into a lube store, what's that on the ground? Pick that up, right? And my 7-year-old would say, Dad, but I didn't put it there. It's not my responsibility. My brother put it there. I get the same response from the lube techs. Right? That pallet, I didn't put it there. I said, I don't care. Right? Whose responsibility is this room? Right? And to be honest, right, we're going to be talking about, easy lubrication wins. I wanted to make it a little bit interesting and a little bit technical, so there's some kind of, equipment and all that sort of stuff. But the reality of it is that the vast majority of gains within the lubrication field are simply, it's housekeeping, right? It's tidying up. It is making sure that someone has ownership of the program. I was telling Drew just in the break, my last visit was to an abattoir about a month ago, right? And I've seen some bad lube storage areas in my day. This one was very grim, especially for a food manufacturing site, right, where you would like to think that it was reasonably clean. There was a 20-litre drum of Shell Cassida, right, chain oil 220. Now, the problem with that is that the Cassida brand was sold to Fuchs in 2016, right? So that is at least how old that 20-litre drum is, right? So there's a lot of stuff that we can do. And part of the reason that room was so bad is because when I said, who's responsible for this room? It was no one. Why do you have so many products on the shelf? Who can go and order product from procurement? Oh, anyone, right? So there were zero controls. And so a lot of that sort of basic process, basic ownership is where we get a lot of our bang for your buck, right? But now, we want to talk about some other things that are a little bit more interesting, right? So first of all, if we want to talk about lubrication, we've got to talk about the importance of it. And the fact is, I'm kind of preaching to the converted. The fact that you have turned up today is suggestive that you think that lubrication is important, okay? But if you need to make the business case to management or whoever it is, I've got a couple of sources. These are I'm not going to read through them. These are mostly for the downloaded slides at the end of this. So if you need to convince anyone, these are all picked from non-lubricant industry sources. If I said, hey, Castrol says that lubricants are really important, well, yeah, okay, of course they're going to. So is Shell, so is Mobil. But here we've got the Italian Association of Maintenance Engineers. This is the Institute of Mechanical Engineers in the UK, right? We can keep going through, right? So this is Komatsu. SKF Mining Solutions. And so we're confronted with this, which is, this was a survey that was done on reliabilityweb.com. So if anyone's familiar with Uncle Terry's website, when confronted with the question, how would you describe the importance of precision lubrication? Overwhelming support for it, right? At least 81% are saying critically important. And if you add in, hey, it's important but not critical, it's 99% of survey respondents. Right, so great. Everyone understands the value. Now let's flip the question the other way around. How many people think that they're doing a good job? Ooh, right? The reverse is true. And so there's obviously this huge gap, right? There is this aspirational, we believe it's important, and we want to do something about it, and yet the vast majority of sites, we're not even close to best practice, right? So what are some of the ways that we can overcome some of these gaps? The first is, I think, and part of this is an education piece, shameless plug for Lube School 1, right, is getting people an understanding that lubes are not a blunt instrument. Yeah, I think it's probably a little bit, maybe we appreciate it less because when you pour oil out of the bottle, it more or less looks the same. The color is just a dye that's put in it. Alternatively, maybe it's purple because you've bought royal purple, right? It's there for branding purposes. But the reality is all oils seem to be the same on the face of it. And that's one of the things that we combat. It's very difficult just from feel to establish what is a quality product and what's not. Right? I did, as a bit of an anecdote, I had a lube tech in New Zealand who insisted that he could tell the quality of the oil by its taste. I highly suggest that you do not follow his lead, right? But when we're talking about oils and the level of protection that they give, this is typical oil film thicknesses. So without going into the details, just assume that it's between 0.1 of a micron and say 10 microns. For scale, right? A human hair, obviously, I'm not a specialist when it comes to human hair, sort of lacking in that knowledge department, but I am told that if I had hair, it would be about 75 microns in width, right? Down to white blood cells, which are about 25 micron. Now, you can't see white blood cells. So that means that somewhere in between those two, right, is basically the resolution of the human eye. And so what that suggests is a couple of things. Number one, right, which always kind of blows me away. Let's take a very critical asset like a steam turbine as an example, right? That's what the steam turbine shaft is, roughly 20 tons worth of rotating metal going at a few thousand RPM. And all that is protecting it from failure is an oil film that if you were able to take a cross-section, you can't see. It is so thin. So we have to get away from this idea that oil is this blunt instrument. It is actually precision engineering, right? I think Castrol's kind of got the best tagline when it comes to this respect. What do they say? It's not just oil, it's liquid engineering, right? That's about whoever was in marketing really earned their keep on that one, right? So that's the thing that we need to impress upon people is it is a precision instrument. But number two, that also tells us a little bit about the types of contaminants which are going to be damaging, right? It is on that sort of same scale. And so we do get, for example, lube techs who will take an oil sample, look at it and go, well, I can't see anything in it, it must be clean. When in fact, the most damaging contaminants are completely invisible to the human eye. So how are they causing this damage, right? This would be example of effectively a fatigue failure, right? So when I kind of teach level 1, I always say it's almost like the rolling elements have to go over a speed bump every time, right? And what that's doing is it's increasing the stress concentration. Eventually you get micro-pitting failures. Now, contaminants are going to affect our lubrication regime in a number of different ways. We can get oil film collapse, we get abrasive wear. I'm just giving you one example. And one thing that's probably not appreciated as well is how hard some of our contaminants can be, right? So obviously, number 10 being diamond, but if you look at, let's say, for example, if anyone works in the alumina industry, aluminium oxides, incredibly abrasive, right? More so than even machining swarf. We know not to take sand and throw it into the engine in our car. It's the reason we have air filters, right? So, needless to say, these contaminants, which, as a reminder, you can't see, are the things that are damaging your equipment. All right, so that then begs the question, how tight should we filter? If we know that the contaminants, which are so damaging to our equipment, are on that sort of size of maybe they're only 1 to 2 microns, that suggests that that's the kind of material that we need to filter out of our oil to maximize the reliability of our asset and reduce the amount of wear that's going on. Okay, so let's come back maybe to that question a little bit. Because I've asked this question to many, many different professionals over the years, right? Does anyone have like a corporate rule around this? Standard micron sizing for filters? 4 micron? Yep. You guys have got 4 as well. Oh, you're both Fortescue, I guess, so that makes sense. 6? Yep. Any reason for these numbers? Do we just pluck them out of the proverbial, So, I put this question to people in my community, right? So there's about 300 respondents, and I gave them limited options, right? But what strikes me is that if you break them up by the type of industry that people are in, you get completely different responses. So, let's start with the people who work in the filtration industry. These are people who sell filters for a living. Okay, they're kind of incentivized to say, there is no lower limit, filter as tightly as possible, because I make more margin by doing that, right? I can sell you the most expensive filters I can. So, makes sense why they would be skewed towards, there's no lower limit. Let's just keep filtering until we filter out everything. All right, what about the end users? The likes of you folks, right? People who are using filtration as a means of increasing equipment reliability. There, the answers seem to center around 3 micron, roughly. And a similar thing, when I put the question to a few people who answered in this survey, well, where did this 3 micron number come from? It's kind of like, well, I don't know, it's just historical. It's kind of what we've always done. It seems relatively safe. Okay. Now you ask the people who make the lubricants, right? And their answer is different again. They're coalescing around almost like 5 or even higher. And so that begs the question, well, what are they scared of? Right? Why do they say 5 micron and higher? Generally, right, there is this concern about additive removal. Right? Now, has anyone experienced that here? Yes? Yep. Yes. And what was the consequence of that? Or degradation? Yep. So in general, the most common response I get is foaming, right? It's the anti-foam additive that gets stripped out of it. So that's one answer to the question. And so is that going to happen to all oils though? And the answer is unfortunately no. So this is one of these it depends kind of questions, right? And the unfortunate reality is that there is no specific answer. So as an example, if you're a Shell supplied site, what I have personally found is that Amala S2, you can strip the anti-foam additive out. S5, you can't. And it's just got to do with the fact that they're different chemistries and different species. Okay? So there's no hard and fast answer. Okay. So what I would say, and this is kind of my first tip, for want of a better word, is if we have an upper limit, if we can only filter to 5 micron, but the damaging stuff is below that size, then it suggests that exclusion, right, making sure those particles don't end up inside of the unit in the first place is kind of our first line of defense. And there's a whole bunch of different ways that we can do this, right? So whether we have positive pressure because you're using a mist system, very rare in the mining industry, which is where most of you are from. Has anyone used dry air or dry nitrogen systems, right, to strip? So number one, it's putting positive pressure on the case, right? So that's helping with exclusion, but also in terms of water removal, unbelievably effective, right? So if anyone's getting water inside of their oils, using dry nitrogen is really effective, and there's actually some kidney loop filtration systems which use this technology as well, right? But yes, can be, well, compared to a vacuum dehydrator, they're actually cheaper and more reliable.
We actually use that very successfully when I was in the power generation industry on a phosphate.
Yeah, yep. Because incredibly hygroscopic, they tend to basically pull water out of the atmosphere. Yeah, and if anyone who's using LM6000s for power generation, Mobile Jet 2 will do exactly the same thing, right? But what I also like to rely on is the humble desiccant breather, right? Now these you've probably seen a million. I picked the smallest one I could because I didn't want to weigh down my bag. So I've got the tiny little cute version here. It's like a Tonka toy, right? Like baby's first desiccant breather. So now these are slightly more complicated than you might imagine, right? There's more that goes into the selection of these than, so generally when I turn up on site and say, oh, first of all, right, we are using these to eliminate contaminants that are coming in, right? So we're trying to catch that sort of 1 to 2 micron debris that's coming in. So first of all, what is the rating of the air filter inside this? That's correct. Crickets is the correct answer, right? So very few people understand what the actual rating is on the filter element that's inside here, right? So that might be one thing to consider. Other things to consider, right? There are different versions of these. So let's say, for example, I go to most sites, let's say mining across Australia, and in general, it's we buy these and we buy the same model in 3 different sizes, and we just put them everywhere. When in fact, there's a whole lot of stuff that goes into these. There are check valves on the bottom to make sure that you don't get water splashing up into them. You get oil coalescers to make sure that the oil doesn't, if you get a lot of mist inside, for example, a gearbox with a lot of agitation, that doesn't contaminate the desiccant. You've got, in some cases, there's sort of these diverters, because the air that's coming out of let's say it's a gearbox, I don't really care how clean that is, right? So there's all sorts of different options that you can actually put with these desiccant breathers. And I highly encourage you to maybe just take a second look at these. Then the next thing as well is, and the other reason why they're so important, it's water removal, right? Water does, we have this kind of, again, using oil as a blunt instrument, we take a look at the oil, and if it's cloudy, it's got water in it. Where if it's clear, then we're fine. In fact, a lot of the bearing damage, and I think Drew is responsible for a lot of this research, so go and talk to him about this, not me. The oil could appear perfectly normal, but we're actually seeing substantial damage to the bearing. There's a whole section on this, in the lube courses on the water damage of bearings, right? So, how do these work? Number one, they're drying the air as it comes into the gearbox. But number two, this is a little bit like, those damp rid containers that you might put in like a closet or something like that. They're just slowly kind of drying the air. It's almost like a wicking effect. These can have a similar effect as well. So very, very useful. But one caution on these, right? What do we do with our PMs? Oh, install breather, right? We're assuming that people know how to install them. Now, you would think it's impossible to screw this up, right? You literally just screw it on. The number of times that I have seen these stickers still on breather elements when they are installed because no one bothered to say, please remove the sticker, right? This particular model actually has some little rubber rings inside. Why are they there? They're just making sure that the package is sealed when it's delivered to you, right? So it hasn't taken on all the humidity from the atmosphere. The number of times I've seen those also have not been removed. How many times have I seen these not screwed on particularly tight? Right? If they're not screwed on tight, air is going to take the path of least resistance. Actually, going to completely bypass the breathers. And you get a lot of people, wow, our breathers last forever. So yeah, they're not drying anything, that's why. Right? Okay, so number one.
Another thing that is, I saw a lot in the mining industry is people would spend money on those desiccant breathers, but they would not close off the chrome-plated breather filler caps.
Yeah.
And so what you have is you put the breather on, it's doing nothing because you have least resistance is the breather cap which is left on. You have to put a proper gasket and close that off completely, forcing the air through the breather. Otherwise, I can't even.
Yeah, it's pointless. Exactly. All right, I better pick up my speed a little bit here. Now, in terms of, and Drew actually spoke about this in his earlier session, which was that it's very difficult for us to invest in reliability and asset management because the payoff often takes so long. This is probably my favorite example, so Nippon Steel. They published this in 2016, but when you look at the years over which they collected data, right, it's very rare that we get a data set like this. And in very basic terms, all they said was, how many filters do we have on site versus the number of pump failures, right? And correlation is not causation, granted, right? But it suggests that, hey, filtration is a very important component of reliability. And if you actually read the full paper, there was a whole bunch of other stuff that they did to improve reliability on site. Now, we end up with this conundrum. We know that filters are important. We know that particles, which are in that 1 to 2 micron range, are really damaging, but we can't filter them out because we have corporate rules and we're concerned about additives, right? Fortunately, there is a new technology on the market that can help with this. So this is what your standard filter or depth media filter looks like. It's kind of this massive cellulose fibers. You can see, hey, if the gap's really small, an additive that's large can't get through. There's a company over in the UK that has developed what they're calling capillary filtration. I don't know why they call it that, but basically the capture mechanism is slightly different. It's almost like if you're on a river, right? Where does the silt deposit on the river? It deposits on the sides, in the bends, or where there's really low flow rate at like the river delta or something like that, right? Incredibly effective, right? And they have proven in a number of different trials, let's say with Castrol, that they do not remove additives. As it happens, also way more efficient. So there are technology solutions for some of these problems as well. All right, now let me talk about oil sampling. So how often do you take and test oil samples? Here in WA, you guys actually do a lot more testing than everyone else does. So I've seen gearboxes that are sampled roughly monthly. That's actually pretty frequent, considering the world average is probably once every 6 months or something like that. But when we're obtaining oil analysis data, I look at it as a combination of contamination, fluid condition, and wear information. And for very critical assets, you've got to cost justify this. There are a range of online sensors now, right? So for fluid condition, you're looking at sort of electrical properties. Contamination, there's online particle counters, and there are wear debris sensors. And if you want to take it to the next level, you've got mid-infrared sensors and image-based particle counters. So this is kind of your ATEN2 technology. This is your spectrolytic. That's your TAN Delta, MP Filtry, and Poseidon. That's sort of the brands that are out there, right? And again, you've got to right-size this. So why is it important with, again, some very critical assets? Why would we want to be doing this, right? Ultimately, because it's got to do with, right, how frequently we're taking samples and the P to F curve, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, right? So if we're not taking samples all that often, or the P to F curve is shorter, we're obviously going to miss that window, right? And there are certain applications for which I have found that these have been quite useful, right? Now, one of the other reasons that we might want to do it, right, and this is a company called Spectralytic that was doing some validation work with ExxonMobil on their infrared sensor, so measuring acid number. And you'll notice, so in their validation, the yellow line is the sensor and the blue line is the samples that we were taking on a regular basis to match the data sets. And you'll notice, whoa, hang on, there's a lot more variability in the lab data, right? So where's that coming from? Well, it's a combination of things, right? No oil sampling program is perfect. There's, I've got to say, plenty of very poor sampling techniques that I've seen out there, right? So contaminated samples, or we mislabel them, or we don't send them to the correct lab. Alternatively, the lab mislabels them. They don't do the test correctly. They test a different sample. So there's all sorts of variation that's built in. So again, if we're looking at critical assets, right, this might be something that we want to consider. And in the, if we want to tie this to the sort of the AI business that everyone's talking about, more data, right, means that we learn more about the asset and eventually we try and build some degradation models around it. Okay, now let's shift from oil to grease, right? So, because I've got a little bit of time left. Over-greasing or under-greasing? Which one's worse at your site? Over-greasing, yes. Yeah, there's a problem which is not unique to Australia, but it seems to be worse here, right? And maybe that's because of the mining context, right? There's a lot more grease that's used. One of the issues is that over-greasing and under-greasing, on the face of it, they kind of look the same, right? You get an increase in temperature, you might get an increase in vibrations, right? So diagnosing that can often be a problem. And I, in some respects, blame these. Now, I'm going to show you a piece of ancient technology. Do you remember these? Huh? The old manual grease guns. So, what's the issue with these battery operated grease guns that are so popular on mine sites these days? So, number one, right, is there's no resistance, right? You don't feel the pressure buildup. You hold the button and you let it rip. And the number of like universal joints I've seen with like just grease just pouring out, yeah, it's a bit grim. The other thing is the lube techs on site. Where are we getting them from? I've asked this question a few times to people that are coming through my level 1 training, and the general response seems to be off the street. Yeah, it's anyone with a pulse that's breathing. Yeah, I used to work in the check-in desk at the airport. I was working in the supermarket before this. I had no job, right? That's generally where we're getting our lube techs from. And I find it wild. Imagine if there was another piece of equipment on site that was rated to pump out 10,000 PSI, right? And we just handed it to people with no training and said, have at it. It's crazy, right? I'm amazed that we do this. Number one, for the safety aspect, right? Grease injection injuries are really bad and generally result in amputations, but also the damage that it's doing to our equipment is unbelievable. So, right, how do we calculate the correct amount of grease? This is also challenging, I've got to say, right? So there are a number of grease calculators online. They all disagree with each other, right? So if you actually run the numbers, someone did this at NLGI in 2024. They ran a 6303 bearing with C3 clearance, and the numbers are up to 80% different for the different OEM calculators. Not only that, here's another complication, right? Even if you manage to figure out the correct amount of grease to put in the bearing, we don't know the history on the bearing. If it's already in an over-lubricated state and we're going to put the correct amount of grease in, we're just going to keep it over-lubricated. If it's under-lubricated, we'll just keep it under-lubricated. So, for me, the obvious solution is, oh my God, let's, didn't expect that. Okay, is the condition-based greasing or ultrasonic. Is anyone using ultrasound for regreasing? Yeah? So, I personally am a huge fan of doing this because it makes, I say idiot-proof. It should make regreasing idiot-proof. There's always a bigger idiot, right? But theoretically, right, let's say, for example, I'm partial to this unit. It's the SDT Lube Expert, and I'm not just partial to it because it shares the name of my business, right? But it literally tells you what to do. Pump 6 shots of grease, then wait. Press enter, right? Pump another 2 shots, press enter. Now, this is not going to work if you're purging, for example, right? That's obviously not going to make sense. But, and then it will tell you, task complete, right? You literally cannot get this wrong as long as you're following the instructions, right? But condition-based ultrasonic greasing, yeah, I think is an easy win, right, for the amount of money that you need to spend. Yes, there are connected sensors and all the rest of it, but to me, this is the easy solution. Yeah, it's got to be running is the only thing, and everything now is behind guards, so that can be challenging, right? But there are ways around that. Finally, grease analysis, right? We don't do a whole lot of it, which is kind of weird, right? Because we do a lot of oil analysis. Grease is a lubricant as well. We should be doing grease analysis, right? My experience of grease analysis is that it is pretty poor, right? And it doesn't give you that much valuable information. Most of the time we take a grease sample, we send it off to the lab, and they say, hey, guess what? It's got a whole bunch of metal in it, and it's contaminated with dust and water. And you go, no shit, right? It's in an open environment in mining. Of course it's contaminated with dust and water. So that's not valuable information. The other thing that I get back from a lot of people is we can't take consistent samples. It's very difficult to get a representative sample, for which there is actually an ASTM standard. So a common friend of Drew and I, Mr. Rich Wurzbach, has developed something called the Grease Thief, right? Great product name, because it steals grease, right? But it is a standardized way of, and I should have brought one, it's only about this big. The quantity of grease required to run a test is about 2 mils, right? And he has a full process for getting representative and consistent samples of grease. The other advantage is, you know, in real terms, what's the most important information that you're getting out of a grease sample? It's probably the amount of wear debris that's in the sample. That's probably the only real nugget of information that you get, and trend that over time. You can actually buy, there's a ferrous debris sensor that you can drop one of these into. It gives you an instant ppm reading of metal, right? And you could just trend that over time on site. Never needs to go to a lab, right? So your turnaround time is effectively 0. Right? All right, so I think that was the 5 relatively easy wins. And I'll leave you with this, right? Again, this is not me, this doesn't come from a lubrication company. It's the Institute of Mechanical Engineers in the US. You spend $1,000, you get $40,000 back when it comes to lubrication. So don't spend your money on the S&P 500, right? Crypto, don't worry about that, right? Where the real gains is in oil and lubrication. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thanks, Rafe. And perfectly timed. Our time is up. But Rafe would love to answer your questions. He's going to be at the Deloitte Speakers Corner at the coffee break, and then he'll be at the Asset Schools booth. Please make sure you evaluate him on the app. That was really outstanding. Join me again in thanking Rafe, please.
Thanks, Rafe.